Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Fernando Lara, and I am not the chair of the department. For those of you who don't know me, I teach history and theory of architecture here at the Weitzman School. And today I'm filling in for our departmental chair, Professor Hosanna Hu, who is not feeling very well tonight. So she asked me to come and introduce our distinguished guests. Uh, the architecture department welcomes Jing Liu and Florian Idenburg, co-founders of Seoul. We want to thank you to the Abend family for sponsoring this lecture. The Abend Family Endowed Lecture Fund was established in 2020 with the purpose of providing financial support for an annual public lecture in architecture to our community. Steve Abend graduated from our school in 1965 with a master's in architecture. His daughter, Linda Abend freshman, graduated from Penn in 2007 with majors in political science and Latin American studies. That's my alley. Steve is currently an architect residing in Kansas City, Missouri, while Linda is an attorney in Boston. We are very grateful to the Abend family and especially to Steve and Linda for their support. So, in 2008, Jing Liu and Florian Idenburg founded the architecture studio Seoul, Solid Objectives Idenburg Liu. The pair first met in Tokyo in 2001 while both were working at Sana'a. Jing has over 20 years of practice and has brought an intellectually open, globally aware, and locally embedded sensibility to her work, spanning a wide range of mission-driven projects. If you haven't done so yet, I really recommend going to their website and reading their writings. Both Florian and Jing's writings are there on the website, and they are amazing. Liu has led Seoul in the engagement with social political issues of contemporary cities, projects like the Artists Loft North Omaha and the Martin Luther King Jr. Library in Cleveland. Jing is currently a board member of Columbia University GSAP and a visiting faculty at Princeton University School of Architecture. She has been, is that not correct? No? Sorry. She has been, that's what ChatGPT is doing to us. She has been inducted to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, awarded New Generation Leader by Records Women in Architecture, and received the United States Artist Fellowship and the Vilsack Prize for her contribution and leadership in the field. I hope those are correct. Florian Idenburg is an internationally renowned Dutch architect with over 2 decades of professional experience. He has made significant contributions to multifamily housing in Brooklyn, where he has designed a number of widely recognized projects that push the boundaries of traditional typologies. He has a particularly strong background in institutional spaces, leading the office on projects as the Kukje Gallery and the Manetti Schramm Museum of Art at UC Davis, as well as a month in Brooklyn. His strength lies in generating imaginative ideas and transforming those into real-world spaces and objects. In recognition of his contribution to architecture, Florian has received several prestigious awards, including the Charlotte Kohler Prize from the Prince Bernhard Culture Fund in 2010, the Architecture Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2022, and the United States Artist Fellow Prize, also in 2022. Seoul has developed a diverse body of work recognized through international awards, exhibitions, and publications. Their projects encompass a diverse range of buildings, including cultural, civic, residential, commercial, and educational facilities, across both new construction and adaptive reuse, spanning temporary installations to long-term urban strategies. Seoul has received numerous awards, including the American Academy of Arts and Letters Awards and the M.A. Stewart's Award for its Amant Art Campus, and the MoMA PS1 Young Architects Award for its pole dance installation in 2010. Their project 450 Warren won Art Daily's Building of the Year in the housing category last year, 2024. Please welcome Jing Liu and Florian Idenburg.
So many awards. Half of it was true, but it's okay. It doesn't really matter. I'm the warm up act for Jing. I will. No. We're gonna tell a few stories around a few themes. We called the lecture at this moment once again with more feeling, and I'll explain a little bit in the beginning why. It's a friend of ours, Mohammed Sharif. He wrote this essay recently in the current Log, the magazine that keeps the sort of critical architecture writing alive in this country, and he coined it once again, but this time with more feeling. And the essay is actually about sort of the idea of newer brutalism. Emmett Ziefman is the editor there. And he's coining this newer brutalism as sort of the contemporary condition of today in which we practice. And Mohammed Sharif, he decided to write about us and connect the newer brutalism with new brutalism, which were the Smithsons, and drawing parallels between our practice and the Smithsons. And actually, he's sort of making four arguments, which I think we will tell tonight through three stories, four sort of things where we maybe carry on the ideas of the Smithsons, who themselves carried on ideas from modernism and modernity. And the four that we will be talking about have to do with composition, so sort of the massing and the three-dimensionality, conglomerate order, as he talks about it. The other is the social or infrastructure as buildings as sort of social tissue, so how to use navigation through buildings as a social connector. A third speaks about the way in which buildings are not just visual, but are sensual, are atmospheric. Navigation doesn't just happen through what you can see, but also what you can touch, light and orientation. And the last is sort of this idea of materials and material innovation and a rawness, a sort of presence of materiality that he recognizes in the Smithson's work, and he correlates with us. And so the idea of once again speaks to sort of an acceptance in a way, and a realization that architecture is ultimately something in which we learn to work within systems, we work within reason, we work and we communicate in context. And in many cases, these the role of design and the role of this thinking has been and still is about optimization, right? About making things efficient, maximizing areas, or making things extremely thin so that there's more space you can occupy, you can sell or rent, and less depth, so to say, within what we do. And so we appreciate this idea of the thinking of design as something that moves us forward, but we also try to ask, for whom are we doing it? What are we optimizing? What are the values that we bring? And so in this idea of modernity, we are also interested in a different narrative and a different way in which we can understand the modern, one that is much more blurry, less sharp, maybe less defined, a little bit ambiguous, a little bit more atmospheric and ephemeral, maybe more soft, more intimate, more domestic, but also more exterior, more connected to an ecology around us, and maybe even more textured, the material being more present. And so we think we can learn a lot from the past, but we also think that there's ways to push, stretch, exercise a way to move this idea of design forward. And so we think a lot about the experience of the body in relationship to these systems and how we navigate that, how we find our way within these contexts. And we try to think about how can we push, stretch, push to the limits, make more elastic, and find ways, maybe points where things might even break, but where do we find liberty and expansion within these ideas of design. And so, already mentioned, very early on, we did this installation for MoMA PS1 called Pole Dance. And it was a direct response, in a way, to this brief. It's MoMA, the treasurer of modernity, the idea that through design we can control our environment. And so we proposed this white Cartesian grid, very rationally organized. But this structure is not a structure that offers stability. It doesn't offer actually support. It's weak. It's actually always on the verge of collapse. It's connected through surf mast bases and connected through bungee cords. So it is a sort of responsive, destabilized system. We cover the entire courtyard of PS1. So it is a continuous sort of interior, but then we populated it with activators, with balls, with hammocks, with pulleys, and other ways in which people could start to affect the system, affect this system that surrounds us, and test its limits and see, where does it break, where does it, how far can we push it? And we also, the sort of the population of these objects, they suggest a type of game, a certain playfulness, but not with rules, but really leaving it up to the user, the inhabitant, the occupant, to figure out how to engage and how to be within the space. And that was a first project, and I think that sets up one narrative and one story, which is like, how far can we stretch and test these systems and create open structures, places for improvisation and spontaneous use. And so to think about how to translate that into something more permanent, we had a first opportunity in, I think it's 2009, when we started to work on this project. This is the Central Valley in Northern California, just south of Sacramento. This is the Sacramento River. The Central Valley, as you know, is where at least California grows its food. So there's agricultural landscapes and the river that sort of organically cuts through. It's also a site of incredibly beautiful light. And so Wayne Thiebaud, a famous Bay Area artist, he moved up there in this area near Davis to depict the landscape and to depict the light quality. And he was one of the artists around this area and around the sort of emerging arts museum and arts scene in Northern California. The other aspects, so this is a museum for University of California, Davis, the Jan and Maria Manetti Schrem Museum of Art. UC Davis being an agricultural school, the landscape being important, but also the environment being very important. The idea of the land as a place of production, a place where you can create your own narratives and futures, a fertile ground, but at the same time, a land that is very fragile, where the environment directly impacts and has effects on sort of what this future might be. And so we wanted to not only incorporate maybe the pictorial and the light and this sort of arts legacy and history in the design of this building, but also really try to make the environmental experience part of the museum experience and make this a museum in which the land in some way continues into the museum and where the environment and the environmental condition are visually experienced within the site. And so we started to, it's a museum for art that doesn't exist, so there's no real need to listen to a program, right? Because we don't know yet what will happen. We started to draw by hand and then by model, thinking about this idea of open structure, a structure that can accommodate any type of use, that starts to occupy the site, that starts to create difference, a sort of palette or of different tapestry of difference, inside, outside, large, small, intimate, grand, dark, open, etc. And functions would find their way sort of on this ground. This ground is the continuation of the campus. Some spaces interior, some spaces exterior. And then we thought, how can we make this, how can we mark this site of activation on the site? And so we came up with this idea of this grand canopy, as we called it, a canopy that offers sort of it marks the place on campus. It also is a place. It's also something that activates the site, that creates and animates what happens underneath, and provides shade, of course, cooling, and a real sort of difference from between inside and outside. It was a competition we won with this idea. And while we started to work, we realized there's a beauty. They have some beautiful growth there around part of the river. And we realized with the depth of the canopies, the tree canopies, is that there's actually sort of a very blurry shadows and very sharp shadows, depending on how the light trickles through for really, really deep grove. And so we were curious if we could use the idea of light and shadow, not just in a sort of singular way, but really to enrich the experience underneath. We used a lot of computation and parametric models to find sort of three different parameters, the spacing of these beams that produce, and I'll show it in a second, it's a three-dimensional beam through which the light sort of trickles down. Its orientation and the openness, and that was basically the variables that we used to create sort of this tapestry of shadow and light that, as the sun moves over the canopy, animates and changes the shadow and the plaza underneath. And so it was design build. It was a very effective budget. We had to work within its limits, otherwise we would lose our fee. Our fee was also in the budget. We worked with precast concrete from a local plant. We corrugated it, so because there's earthquakes, you need very big joints in California. But by corrugating it, the sort of the lines and the patterns, they absorbed the joint. And then the primary steel, we also found a way to, although it has this sort of double curved geometry, only use single curved beams by sort of plying it over. And then we worked together with Front, the engineers, to develop this beam type that we fabricated in China, 920 unique beams, single puzzle pieces that then were actually quite fast and effectively installed within a couple of weeks as a puzzle piece, the 900. This is the last one going in. What you also see is that so an aluminum coil, aluminum coil is about 5 feet wide, and so laying out the pattern of the joints was also quite important, the way it patterns underneath the shadow. And so here you see the building that opened already now 10 years ago, 2016. Yeah. Actually, our friend Iwan Ban, who took these pictures, is back there this Friday to shoot the landscape, because the landscape is very much part of the site as well, but it takes sometimes 10 years before that is fully grown. And you see sort of how throughout the day the patterning changes, and also what this produces, this canopy, which was not, the space in front of this building was not part of the brief, it's extra space, but just by this sort of light and open structure, you invite activation, you invite use that you haven't anticipated, and ways of gathering that are new. And also it allowed us to create openness within the gallery, so the canopy shades the glazing, and so even within the gallery itself, there is this relationship to the exterior. It was the first LEED Platinum museum, while also being able to actually incorporate sort of openness and connectivity. And so I'm very curious. This is when we just planted it, and hopefully in a week we will have some new photos of this being a 10-year-old grove. I'm going to skip the plan. So this is California, and then fast forward to now. Very different campus, very different landscape, very different environment. Williams College, a small college, northern or western Massachusetts. The Clark Art Institute is nearby, Mass MoCA is nearby. This is a very early view, 1851, of Williams. And what you see is this quintessential sort of New England small college, in some way trying to negotiate this very agricultural, rural landscape again. Here it's hilly, not as flat as the Central Valley, with vernacular architecture. And in the middle you see Lawrence Hall. Lawrence Hall was the library, and eventually became the museum. They started to show work. You see it here in the middle. There were some wings that had extended. And then gradually, Charles Moore actually twice extended the museum. And he, which you see here, this is the image from the back you see over there. This is the last extension somewhere in the 80s. He was trying to reconcile the institutional and the agricultural. He did it in his own way. He sort of just smacked in a sort of barn to the back facade. And he also introduced the ironic columns, not the ionic columns, but the ironic columns. As you see, they're not structural. They are cut. They are ironic. The museum didn't want to pay for that, or the college, so he paid for them himself. And apparently now they might be remodeling this building, and they might get rid of the ironic columns. So if anybody wants to share, we are trying to save the ironic columns, because I think it's quite interesting part of history. But so in some way this reconciliation between, say, the institutional and the landscape and the context is also something that we are thinking about in our design. The college, they asked us to move the museum, have a ground up building there where the old hotel used to be, on the left, which is really the entrance to campus. This is it's a small campus, 2,000 students, and the village and the campus are basically one and the same. And so moving it there at the entrance, at the roundabout, announces that the arts are important. They are important for Williams. And so they wanted a real strong, present building. Their art history program is very good. Their arts leadership program is very good. The arts are fundamental to Williams, and so that was what needed to be announced in this new building. And so it's really a teaching museum. It's a museum where students learn how to work within a museum. This is the site. You see the roundabout here on the left. A lot of people that pass through town, they will see this building. Town Hall is next door. The library is on the other side. So it's a real sort of hinge between campus and landscape and the region beyond. And in some way, when we spoke about this struggle of the sort of the New England college architecture and this topography, we were more interested in thinking sort of what we could see around in the farms of the Berkshires, which is more relaxed in a way and loose the way it sort of settles itself on the site, and not necessarily an architecture of walls, but much more of volumes and maybe roofs. And also thinking about the climate and the exterior and the way in which the site and the campus is part of teaching and part of joy for the students, but also how it can get really hot in the summer, but also very cold in the winter. It's much more extreme fluctuation than in Davis. And so a design process in which we designed actually for a committee of 40 people. We had a monthly design review. We did a multi-stakeholder design process to develop a language and a set of aspirations through variations in model and tools and expression, ultimately landing on a project that consists of a sort of a loose assembly of volumes, areas that are connected with these open, transparent sort of passageways that connect you to the landscape. And so this is the south, this is where the roundabout is. There's a place for gathering, and there's a place, this is the education and object lab. This is where the students will work on their shows and learn how to work in a museum. Classrooms over there, and then 2 wings with galleries. And a courtyard. As you come in, you see daylight, so open, transparent, and welcoming. We think a lot when we think about galleries. There's many different ways in which galleries allow you to tell stories. And since these are aspiring curators that work here in the museum, it's both sort of for the students, but it's also, of course, public. But so we thought a lot about what is the different ways in which you can move through these galleries, what are different ways in which you can tell stories, not just a single sort of enfilade type of storytelling, but actually by creating choice, by creating moments where you as a visitor have to choose how you control your narrative. Suddenly there's like multiple narratives that can coexist within one structure, and basically everybody can in some way design and produce their own story, and it also allows for the curators to think much more in parallel narratives. And so thinking through the gallery sequence and the way you move through to really challenge also the students and think differently about how to show art. What you also see, so sustainability also here was an incredible ambition. And so very early on, we decided to work with timber, with mass timber, as a way to connect all these individual volumes under this large large roof made out of timber. And what you see here, the timber normally, and I'll speak about that in a little bit more detail after, it comes in these sort of flat planks. But here you see how it sort of drapes over these volumes, and it extends beyond the building out, creating a porch and in between space to cover, protect from snow or from shade, or to help shade in the summers. And really, again, have the campus continue into the building. So not a museum of walls. There's many museums that use the wall as the way to define what the building is, but actually thinking much more through this idea of a roof and a continuous landscape. So very quickly, I'm sure everybody learns this now. What is the difference between sort of the organic grown trees in the past and these cross-laminated timber, which is basically 2-directional timber, and it comes in very precise, very thick, very stable, large slabs. We learned a lot. This was our first mass timber building. We worked with Fast and Ebb engineers out of Vancouver, and the wood is being produced in Quebec with Nordique. And when we were working with them, we discovered that although these are really thick pieces of wood and really large spans, that if you transport them, they actually sag. They start to become weak again. You see the pliability. We were drawn to it. We were excited about this idea of these stiff things becoming weak and soft. And so we started to work with them to test. What if we let gravity loose on these really rigid and thick planks? What if we suddenly let sort of its self-weight start to warp and change the shape? And so Nordique, the guys there in Canada, they got really excited about it as well. And so we set up a testing, this one, yeah, a test setup. And we started to measure like how far under self-weight can this system, this become elastic, this stiff thing, start to warp and ply. And so we found, a quite substantial amount of deformation. And we used all that information, all the data that came out of these tests to feed it back into the design of the roof and sort of the sculpting of the roof shape as it sort of drapes over these volumes underneath. And that produced sort of the geometry and the form. Obviously negotiating gallery heights, the height of the auditorium, etc., creating this sort of continuous landscape that will be clad in an aluminum shingle. And the mock-up, this is already old. Currently the whole slab has been poured, and today the first timber arrived on site. So, and it will go up relatively quickly in the next couple of months, and sort of you will see the form sort of find its shape. So that was a story about elasticity, and now a little bit of a different story about the in-between air, the environment, the idea of what is the edge of a building. And it starts with this project we did for the Chicago Biennale, I guess also already a number of years ago. I forgot how long ago, a long time ago, when Sharon and Mark Johnston Markley were the curators. And we worked with an artist, Anna Pravacci, on a performance piece which uses wind and air to create a musical performance. We worked with local performers that used wind instruments. So they used the flute, the saxophone, a soprano, and a trombone. And these funny outfits, these funny cocoons that they have, that's actually the sort of ergonomic space defined by sort of the space they need to play their instruments. And they use wind, right, to make music. And so they breathe in and they breathe out music. And what they breathe through is these cocoons made out of air filtering material. So this is material you find normally in your air conditioner, and it cleans the air. So as they play the music, as they perform the music, they clean the air. And so it was sort of it was called l'air pour l'air, the idea of what is this environment around us, what is the space that we occupy, what is our role within this environment, and how can we think about that relationship between sort of interiority or the intimate space and the conditions beyond. And sort of on a larger scale, we worked concurrently or in the same sort of time on a temporary home, a sort of nomadic concept home called Mini Living. We called it Breathe, and maybe in a similar sort of idea, we thought of this as a prefab steel structure of elements that fits within a shipping container and can sort of be moved around. And then we dressed it in this coat, a fabric layer, and we made it out of this Purify mesh, a very advanced Japanese mesh, actually, that has a slight magnetic quality in the makeup, and so it pulls out the toxins out of the air, so it pulls the heavy metals out of the air. And so the skin of the building actually becomes sort of an air filtering device and cleans the air as it moves into the house. And so the idea, and we clad it in two layers, one of this air filtering material, and the second interior layer that offers privacy and offers, but at the same time allows light sort of through. And yeah, a concept home where we started to play and think about do we really need these hard boundaries between inside and outside, and sort of what is the relationship between us and the environment, us and other occupants. The idea of transparency and layering were things that we thought about within this project. And so the air as a material and the air as a space is informing this other project that's almost finished, and we will share now, and also our first office building. And the office building is a very interesting typology because in many ways an office doesn't need much except for a core and a curtain wall. And then open space that often needs to be maximized because it is purely within sort of the commercial reality where these office towers and office buildings live. This was a particularly ambitious office because of its sustainability goals. Again, they spoke about this concept of blue marble, the earth as a healthy place. And also it needed to be on a very precarious and very difficult site where structure and the support needed quite some acrobatics. And so we were drawn to this image by, it shows Hercules assisting Atlas, keeping up the globe, and I'll explain why. It is in Amsterdam. Amsterdam, as you know, has a beautiful old center that you can see there at the sort of in the back. There's a lot of tourism, as you might know, coming into the Netherlands, and a lot of them come to Amsterdam and they come to Central Station. And basically, it's sort of clogging the city, and so the city itself is opening up to its outskirts, to its the ring, and this used to be the highway ring, and this used to be a very small station, but currently is growing to be sort of one of the most dense business and also residential districts. And they're building a new high-speed train station to Paris, and trains are the future. They have been for a long time, but they continue to be the future. But so this is going to be the main station actually in Amsterdam, which will be right there. This had been developed over time. There's a number of buildings, but one site, this little site, is the site where we're working on it, remained open. A sort of new civic axis is forming here. There's a new courthouse. OMA is working on a museum here. There's the library and the university. So it's not just part of this more sort of business district, but it's also very much part of the civic axis. And so, is that me? Sorry, just to wake you up. There's an incredible line of characters here. There's OMA, there's MVRDV, there's P. Kopfried, there is Vignoli, there's Michael Graves, Erik van Egeraat, and UN Studio. And then this site, was open for a long time. These buildings have all been built in the last 20 years, but more in the earlier period of those last 20 years. Only this site had remained open. Why? The city had a tram line that used to go there. And so they said to the developer, can we keep the site for open until we do the station? And they said, sure. But we do want to build a parking garage all the way under the entire site. So half of the site had already become a parking garage. And so when they asked us to build this building and create another volume there, we could hardly touch the parking garage. The parking garage was already filled with cars. There was concrete structure. There was 5 layers of cars. The deal was that we had to build on top and over the parking garage. From an energy and embedded carbon point of view, we had to reuse the parking garage as the foundation of the building, so we didn't have to do new excavation. We could actually build on top of the parking garage and keep the parking garage in operation while building. And this is the other little triangle over there, and there we could have structure. Office design is mostly governed by daylight, and so there's a certain depth that you can have in the slab, and that produces sort of a type of volume. And so through puzzling and organizing the massing and moving this massing towards the edge of the site, we created sort of this corner that sort of complements that area and negotiates between the business district and the civic area. And obviously, we couldn't help ourselves but start to wrap or drape or think through how do you create within this sort of boxy volume something that unifies it and that creates sort of a more fluid continuity. Because of that parking garage, we needed to build a big transfer structure, 8 meters tall, so 26 feet, I guess. This is a public plinth with public program. Obviously the entrance, also bike parking, you'll see in a second. And then wood, of course, a timber structure, 14 floors, people in the structure, and then this skin that envelopes it. And so here you see the physical model with the precast columns sort of bridging from the parking grid to this wood grid. And then you'll see later this light structure that sort of brings it all together. And this went up in the last year. You see the precast columns, and you see the difference in density of the grid between the timber. 14 stories is a very dense grid. It totally changes the way you can do office layouts. But you see how massive these columns are. This is more than 2 feet solid wood. So it's really sort of cool. The public spaces, and this I wanted to show because we have in the Netherlands this entire area and this path in. It's in total about 20 feet, 20% of the ground floor is for bicycle parking. So you bike into the building, you park your bike, you take a shower, and then you go to work. No other parking allowed or required, just bike parking. This is the public spaces. And then because of the sound and because of the thermal performance, we needed triple glazing. We needed 3 layers of glass in the curtain wall system and some mesh to shade, to keep daylight coming in, but shade direct sunlight. And then we got excited about the idea, what if you start to peel open one of these layers of glass, so you keep a double glass layer go down, but one of these layers starts to create this sort of in-between space that negotiates between these volumes. It creates a space that is not inside or outside, that actually produces sort of a unity in form, and at the same time produces a different type of in-between non-mechanized climate that offers comfort. Comfort throughout the year, that extends basically the seasons and creates, yeah, a space where people can open their window, where you can go out for a call, for a meeting, or what have you, but really literally allow you to escape the office environment in this sort of this atrium type space, which was very complex and very interesting and very ambitious within, you know, what you could call is a spec building. These are pictures from, I think, last week. I will go in 10 days for the sort of final punch list, and it will open at the beginning of this year. And so for us also first within this space. Well, that was the warm up. Now Jing is going to do the real presentation. So you can wait till we come back.
All right. All right. I hope you guys are still awake. Before we started the lecture, we had to do this YouTube video taping that was called Proposition, and we were asked one question: what would be the projects that we really want to do? And I think our answer was theater and housing or houses. And theater is because this space of collective attention is something that's really remarkable, and you are all here paying attention, hopefully, to what we're saying, and that we really don't take it lightly. I think the ability for a large amount of people to kind of focus their attention on something is something quite magical, and it's only human that can do it, as far as I know. And then the other project type is housing, which is the topic that I will be talking about today. We have been trying to do housing from the beginning. This is not new. You all have housing as part of your core curriculum. And for a reason, the very reason that housing is what defines probably the large percentage of our building stocks in any environment, urban or rural, but also it's where we spend the most time. And this is when we wake up every morning. This is when we were born into and kind of grow up in. And this is where we dream, you know, for a really large chunk of our days. And I think since we're talking about thinking, feelings and not thinking today. So I want to talk about how we feel about housings today, in today's age. Um, how do we feel about housing? Most of us live in the urban environment, and I had to think about. I just bought myself the Red Book by Carl Jung. I'm much looking forward to kind of have it arrive in our house. But Carl Jung is this psychoanalyst, if you haven't heard about him, who collaborated with, maybe you have all heard, Sigmund Freud, who felt actually the moment that he parted from Freud is that he felt Freud's thinking of this focusing on the ego and this drawing direct line from who you are to where you're coming from in this very kind of singular way was too limiting and restricting. So he recorded in the Red Book his dreams and animas and all these deities and things that we as human beings were connected to, this deep subconscious. And he also spent 30 years building one stone tower for himself in Switzerland. Beautiful environment, beautiful earth and nature, all by himself, by hand. And so this idea of this house is both a house for your soul. He famously said that he thinks that the prima mater of our world is the soul, and that the soul is buried deep in the earth, right? But unfortunately or fortunately, we don't live in the earth anymore. Most of us live in the built environment. And what has the built environment undergone in the last, I would say, like 100 years or so, is this overly kind of Cartesian kind of thinking that you already saw Florian's presentation, that we feel that it's limiting and it's not in all that actually can contain our souls, so to say, our feelings, because we tend to rationalize and simplify and reduce and make very flattened kind of environment in that. And there's a dire consequences of who we become as human beings in this environment. We already talked about the brutalism and Allison and Peter Smithson in the beginning. And, there was a lot of lesson to be learned from that post-war period where people really thought about what happened to our world after the two wars, and how do we rebuild from there, and what were the important things that we need to kind of embed into our humanity. And one of them is social interactions, and the other is humor as well. And it's in these spaces where kind of we have this collective interactions and attentions is where the humanities can be rebuilt. But we can even look further back in history, not in the post-war era, but in even before that, most of our housing and houses had this in-between spaces that are not the private realms, the engawa of the Japanese architecture, even the stoop in New York, brownstone, courtyard in the Chinese architecture. You can find numerous examples in many different domestic architecture typologies throughout the history. And this is exactly also the places where at least the early modernists thought, even before the war, that this is the place where society is formed, the earth, the urban earth, so to say. And they called it streets in the sky. There are many kind of acronyms for them. And this is where the milkmen talk to the kids, where roller skaters are formed and trained. And obviously, we also know that both in the United States and in England, there are many examples of this kind of in-between space, and these corridors become exact place of expressions of dire conditions of a certain social class people. They were out of job and uncared for by our societies, and somehow architecture kind of becomes the scapegoat for providing those spaces to express that. And we also look at the current and the more contemporary conditions where we have lost those in-between space. Florian already talked about how the rationalities and kind of the over optimizations of our buildings and pushing out this in-between space created basically no place to express those moments of anger, moments of despairs, and we are all kind of pushing up against this very thin layer of glass windows. Or, as you know, that the most ubiquitous way we get to our most private spaces in our living environment, environments, are these double-loaded corridors. And this was not the case until fairly recently. Double-loaded corridors were not really even allowed in building codes in many of the cities until the 70s. And because of the need to make more efficiencies and optimize the housings, we put the two means of egress into the building, and so that we can build more efficiently. So this, unfortunately, are the spaces that are representing maybe 10% of your building square footage, and is also probably the lowest ceiling height of your lived environment, and you probably just want to get through it as quickly as you can and not say hi to your neighbor. And so from the beginning of our office, we did a lot of competitions for housing, and they were all a little bit different from what the typical housing typologies are. So we never won those competitions, and we never did it. And until actually in Mexico, in Leon, which is a kind of a city, fast-growing city in the center of Mexico, asked us to come and solve their problem. In Mexico, as well as in many other kind of fastly urbanizing cities in urban cores around the world, there is the problem of huge migrant workers converting from agriculture population to industrial population in very rapid speed and very short period of time, and there's not enough housing for them to live in this kind of semi-urban environment. So there has been a lot of kind of this really rapidly rolled out housing programs that just build very cheap and very kind of repetitive housing that converts a lot of previously rural or forestry land into this residential land that have very limited and low occupancy. So it's actually a very poor efficiency. When you talk about efficiency, and this is a very bad way of using agricultural land and converting agricultural land and forestry land. And what happens with this urban sprawl is that also there's really rarely any maintenance and social services and hospitals and schools and trash pickup even in these areas. So it's really becoming a big problem. So what the city of Lyon asks us to do is to come here, come to their city and kind of think about a prototype that we can build in the more closer to the center of the city, in the city core, which is still quite low dense, and really think about a higher density building that can provide people kind of humanly, uh, just human environment to living, but also being able to make the city much more efficient and to kind of really convert some of this urban sprawls back to agricultural or rural land. So we worked with the city, with the planning department and the communities in the city, and then really looked at what they need and what are the challenges. Most people live very close to the land, on the one-story buildings or two-story buildings. So this really attachment to the ground that is really hard to kind of overcome psychologically. Many of them have not lived in the kind of mid or high-rise buildings. And also the fact that these are social housing, so they're for people who make less than $7,000 a year. So we need to come up with a prototype that really matches the urban sprawl kind of model, economic model, and build a building that at $30,000 per unit. So those were some of the challenges that we had to overcome with this exercise. So obviously you start, or everyone would start by thinking about, okay, what's the cheapest way of building, which is, as just kind of lining up rectangular boxes with a double the corridor, and we definitely didn't want to do that, and that was not the reason that they asked us to come either. So we thought about, okay, how do we make that into a single loaded corridor, and having kind of exposure of light and air on both sides, and as well as maybe some kind of courtyard space that can be more private for the residents. And then we took it a little bit further, kind of rotating it and twisting it into two different sized courtyards so that each unit can kind of have different orientations, and the courtyard also becomes much more interesting and playful. And so we went undergone a series of kind of formal studies and really looked at the corner conditions and how it also projected itself as an object into the environment and the surroundings, and it ended up with this version that we're very happy about. And these are very small units, as you can see here in the unit plan. So it was very important that we come up with a facade design strategies that allowed some privacies to the residents while also kind of created this visual connectivities. So you see this facade panels, we thought of them as precast panels that would rotate and directed your view from the inside to the outside in a very strategic way. And then we thought, it needs to be very cheap, so let's just come up with this one precast panels, and then we can rotate them in different orientations, and that would be really easy. And then we sent it to the local planning department, and they said, okay, we can give it a try. And then they tried precast panel vertically. Obviously did not work. But at the same time, they also sent us a picture of this same shaped walls in brick, and they said that basically everyone in this town can lay brick because that's how they work with their more kind of low-rise buildings. And can we please just do a brick building? And we thought that, okay, yeah, if we do a brick building, it might be very labor intensive and might take a long time, and maybe we can also do something with that labor and with that skills, something a little bit more interesting. So we came up with this very customized CMU block. It's pretty much the same thing as the CMU block you see here, but instead of that typical rectangular shape, they're a little bit funkily shaped, and we have two different shapes. One is a standard one, and one is one that you put next to the window. And they all have 4 to 5 sides, so that basically when you rotate them, you're able to create many different orientations. And we also couldn't really afford to do a CD drawing, a construction drawing. So what we basically asked them to do is that you just place one of this corner unit, and then you use the standard unit, and then when you hit the window, you just start again by kind of offsetting it a certain distance. So it was very much kind of a simple instructions, and in the end, we were able to create pretty much the same effect as the precast panel, but with even more textures to it, and then created more interesting kind of readings under the light. So this is the corner. It's pretty much the tallest buildings in that area. So it was very important that it had a civic quality to it as well. And in fact, before it even opened, the building kind of started to gather all the shops and the markets around it. But on the inside, it still is quite private, and the residents can learn how to ride bicycles. And on the inside, everyone kind of decorates and customize and personalize these units for themselves. And we were able to document this thanks to their openness and invitations. So that proved to some people in New York that maybe this kind of way of thinking and this way of reintroducing some of the principles that I would say the early brutalists, first generation brutalists were working towards was valid, is still in our day and age, and there could be an updated version of that. I think those messages were kind of heard, and people kind of started to ask us if we would try to kind of try it in New York City, which is notoriously difficult to many people have been trying to kind of really figure out how to do housing in New York differently. And finally, who we started to collaborate is actually two architecture adjacent developers. And this is another lesson that I want to talk about today, is that you don't all have to become architects. You can also work in a very architecture adjacent fields like developers and in the city plannings and material world that actually would help the architecture as a whole to move forward and innovate. So these are two developers who one worked at Norman Foster for 8 years and one is the son of an architect. And so they're both very steeped into, the challenges as well as the ambitions of architecture today. And they came to us, and our office is right here, and then they bought a corner lot across the street from a NYCHA Housing, which is the New York kind of housing authority. And this was a church that was burned down, and in the very much coveted, kind of desirable, expensive brownstone neighborhood in Brooklyn. As you can see, this building is bigger than the brownstone buildings surrounding it, and I will explain why. So in this series of buildings, we repeated and try to incorporate as much as possible the principles and kind of ideas that we wanted to achieve in the housing. One is really kind of creating more outdoor living opportunities, covered outdoor spaces that are defined and that really have a connection, meaningful connection to your living environment, and really foster that collective sensibilities and having more of a space of interactions and casual encounters between the neighbors, and also having a kind of porosity with the city and a dialogue with the city. So it's not just a kind of closed in building that's just looking inside. And in all of these buildings, we are working on the corner lot. Why? Because in the corner lot, and actually even in the middle of the lot in New York City, and probably this is the case in many other places, that you have these two things that often governs housing. One is envelope, so the buildable envelope that's determined by your influence as a building mass to the surrounding areas. So you can't cast too much light, there's height limit to it, and there's also kind of just setbacks and height limit that kind of governs the massing of the building. And then there's also the FAR, which is a floor area ratio, which is determined by densities of certain area. You probably are all familiar with it. And what happens with the kind of interaction between the two is that in certain lot, the FAR is bigger than the envelope, but in most cases, the envelope is bigger than the FAR. And especially in lots like smaller lots or medium-sized lots, the efficiency of the building kind of determines how much sellable square footage you can build. And if you build a really efficient building, it doesn't really fill up the entire kind of envelope. So especially in the corner lot, the envelope is much bigger than what the FAR is asking you. So what we decided to do, and typically in the kind of developer's mind, it doesn't really matter how big the envelope is. You try to make the least space outside of the sellable square footage. So typically the golden rule is you keep everything under 20%, which are common space, corridors, mechanical space and structures and so on and so forth. That's why we end up with the kind of building types that we have. And what we decided to do in most of these buildings is actually to take a complete different logic, which is to build as much towards the maximum envelope. And then by doing so, what we are we're actually inflating, because the FAR is limited. What we're inflating is actually the non-sellable in-between space. So those are the spaces like the terraces that you see in these buildings, as well as that courtyard space here and the backyard space here. Some are required and some are completely voluntary in our buildings. And so in most of the buildings, what you see here is one really kind of signature space is this, we call it, you can call it mudroom, you can call it engawa, but it's this space that's in front of your home that is covered. It feels like a extension of your room, and where you can park your bike and take off your dirty boots, but also just relax and sit before you kind of go into the house or when you're leaving. And what we also did is to take as much of this, the egress and the staircase, fire staircase outside of the building as possible. By building it with concrete structures, we're able to do that with this site's buildings. So always one of the two means of egress is outside, and it becomes a social space. It becomes your main means of circulation. So it's not just some place that's tucked away inside the building that's dark and no one uses, and it really becomes this social space. So it was quite difficult to convince the building inspector or plan examiner that this is a legitimate one means of egress that's not stacked on top of each other mechanically, but it's really sculpture and it kind of moves around the building. But we were able to kind of convince the plan examiner that it would meet that requirement of life safety. And then on the inside, as you can see, all of the units have at least 3 or 4 orientations with connection to at least 1 or 2 terraces towards the outside. So the interior space also have this extension towards the context around you. And that also means that a lot of this in-between space and then this kind of common space become really domesticated and kind of seasonally changed throughout the life of the residents. So this is the second building we did with this developer with same principles. Is a much taller building with a much more kind of a constricted site. What we decided to do here, because there's not so much wiggle room, we kind of, if you think about a dice that you shake a little bit, and I know that typically you try to align, everything in a kind of a rational way, but we decided to actually twist them so that they become loose from each other and create a little bit more in between space. So here in this building, we cladded the whole building with this metal mesh, similar to the one that was used in the canopy in the Menendez building, so that it creates this kind of transparency, additional transparency from the inside to the outside. Here you can see the unit. They're all very irregular. Actually, the people who live in this building and the people who visit this building are appalled by how good it feels to not have an apartment that's rectangular, because then you suddenly have an expanded relationship to your surroundings orientations as well. All right. This is a very tall building. Well, not very tall, but tall building that had to be served basically by elevator. So the elevators lobbies are the ones that really opens out to the environment and to the cities. And this is the third building that we are doing. We have just finished with the same developer. It's a building that straddles two zoning district. So you see one that takes on more of a brownstone typologies, and then another one townhouse typologies, and then the corner building that becomes much more kind of playful and sculptural, like the one before. And this is a building that that we were able to create many more different unit mix, and again, as it got bigger and bigger, we realized actually drawing all this different atypical building unit plans are becoming a little bit more labor intensive. So in these buildings, we actually opted for a precast panel. But we had many different shapes of the precast panels that's able to accommodate the atypical conditions and the idiosyncratic kind of facade types in the building. But the precast these days are so technology is so efficient, it's so smart that we are able to kind of create all these different types without too much added cost, and it all went up very, very fast. So we're also learning as the buildings scales up, where do we have to kind of find a little bit of efficiencies. And in the last buildings, you can see here, which is also in Brooklyn, not so far along the canal of in Brooklyn. This is the Gowanus Canal. It used to be heavily industrial, heavily polluted, and it was super funded for about 15 years. And now finally they're starting to build this really big buildings that's kind of coming up in that entire area. So we are also building a quite big building. This is 160 units, but it's all rental, and it's about 30% affordable. So within this kind of affordable envelope and the constraints, we now have to really kind of think about how do we introduce some of these principles, so like different orientations in the apartment that are very small. By rotating these units, these are becoming a little bit more repetitive because we can draw atypical units for 160 of them. But we were able to kind of rotate them in some places, and then in another direction in other floors, and then created this kind of corner condition that allowed the different orientations in this small apartment, but also double loaded corridor, minimizing that and having all the corridors kind of to lead into the exterior as much as possible. So as you can see here, this condition, which is something that's rarely afforded in New York City, and it's able to be introduced in this affordable units. And this is the latest construction pictures, and we're very happy to see some of this social space are kind of taking shape finally. And we are not doing this alone. It's not just Florian and me. We have about 15, 20, depends on the time, in our office. Very young, committed people that know that everything we do is not taking the easiest and the path of least resistance, and we're having fun doing it. Thank you.
We have time for about 3 questions, if anybody has any.
Hi. Thank you so much for that presentation, especially both of you, like having separate presentations, I feel like had different emphases, and it was really interesting to hear both sides. I kind of have a question relating to each of them, if there's time for that. But my first one was about the mesh. That seems to be like a signature um, sort of design motif for the firm. And I was really struck by the essay you introduced in the beginning about, once again, with more feeling. And I'm wondering where you think the mesh fits into that um, kind of call for more feeling in architecture. And then my second question is maybe more fun, like in light of the recent election in New York. There's a really exciting energy for more affordable housing. I'm wondering if you feel that way, like whether, um, like Mamdani and his initiatives, you think will maybe push like interesting housing, or maybe, yeah, just like what you
What do
think
we
that
think
might
about
bring
it?
for the
Yeah.
design scene.
I'll answer the housing question. You can answer the mesh question. Yeah. No, for the housing, I think, yes, I think, we really have to solve the affordability problem, and it's not an architectural problem per se. I really think that it's the problem is somewhere else, right? And what the architects have to do is, I think at least that what we want to do is to insert in this conversation not just quantity but also quality, right? Because the whole housing discussion is all about, oh, we need to make another, 50,000 buildings, units this year, right? And then because of that kind of false crisis and urgencies, then developers, especially nonprofit developers, often resort to, if you can just build it, it doesn't really matter what it is. And then we end up kind of lowering the standard of housing and lowering kind of our built environment in those moments. So what we try to do is to introduce kind of at least examples that even with very limited means, you can build better, and we can create a better, just living environment, and so that it doesn't let the conversation slip, too low.
Everything is a mesh in a way, meaning it's about where is there something and where is there nothing, right? And so you can scale that to the very small fabric, but also to urban fabric, or the way you build, yeah, you organize massing. And so in general, we think a lot about not necessarily mesh as a material, but really the idea of porosity and openness and the ability to sort of delaminate maybe the layers that we surround ourselves with. And fabric has been useful as a tool, sometimes as a metaphor, sometimes as a material in model making, and it has translated to many different sort of. It has a variety of sort of applications, I think, in our work. But we're not necessarily interested in the idea of fabric as a material, but much more in the effects of meshes as a way to create openness and connectivity.
Well, first, thank you so much for the amazing lecture. I've seen your work as I've gone through my education, so it's kind of a surreal moment to have you guys here. And so my question is, what kind of things push you when it comes to innovation, in particular aesthetics? Context can drive a lot of like information that informs the work. So I'm interested in how you guys keep your design methodology innovative when you see things start to stagnate, and the role that the label like newer brutalism has started to play. Has that been something that has kept you pushing the work, or is that something that's kind of been post-applied afterwards? But thank you so much.
Innovation is an interesting term because it's often understood in a certain context. And I mean, what we also showed is that maybe a lot of these things are not necessarily innovative. They are actually just reintroducing things that have been lost or purged, out of our daily life by systems that optimize, right? So in some way, it's not really like it's pushing the boundaries, but it is in a way just creating space to bring back maybe some of the things that were lost, hence the title. And so innovation often puts it in a sort of a technological sphere, but I think it's really just looking carefully and trying to find within the systems of today how you can recreate some of the space that has been sort of purged out.
Yeah, I have a different answer, which is collaboration, because we collaborate a lot with just fabricators, artists, performers. I think, everyone gets a little bit contrived in their own conversations. And if we just think about innovation as an architect, we won't get anywhere. So, anyways, architecture, we don't build architecture, we don't make architecture. We have to convince other people to come along, right? So I think a lot of our innovation happens in actually conversations and collaborations with other people.
The end. Okay. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.